Good afternoon all and welcome all. We'll be starting in a short while. Vishwi, can I request you to kindly unshare your screen, and I would request Devanshi to share her screen.
Yes, ma'am.
Good morning, Dr. Stevens. Can you hear me? Dr. Stevens, are you able to hear me? Dr. Stevens, can you hear me? Devanshi, can you hear me?
Yes, madam. Voice is audible.
Yeah, you're audible.
Dr. Stevens?
Yeah, the problem was at my end. I'm good now.
Yeah. Are you able to hear me now?
I can. It was, I have my microphone, my loudspeaker switched off from yesterday.
Okay, fine. Good morning to you and good afternoon to all the participants. Welcome for day 2 of our workshop on structuring, negotiating and closing license agreements. Today, Dr. Stevens, he would be talking about valuing technologies. Without wasting more time, I would request Dr. Stevens to kindly start his session and share his screen.
So, good morning, good evening. So today we're going to talk about valuing technologies. One of the most challenging and I think perhaps scary things, challenges for people who are new to technology transfer. I know I certainly am. Let's think about the technology transfer process. We get our disclosure. We do a first look technology assessment. That's what I call it. Different people call it different things, but you need to do some assessment of the technology to make sure that it's got commercial potential. Then you need to market the technology because unless you're someone like Harvard or MIT or Stanford, people probably aren't going to beat a path to your door. You're going to have to attract people who want to license it. Hopefully, you get an expression of interest, and then you go into a negotiation, and all of the considerations in the license agreement that we discussed yesterday come into play. And at the end of the day, hopefully, you finished up with a signed deal. There's a couple of things you need to do along the way. Yesterday, we talked about developing your licensing strategy. And today, we're going to talk about one of the things you need to do before you go into your negotiation, which is the valuation of the technology. I'm going to talk about valuation versus pricing, what those two concepts are and how they differ. We'll talk about how value is extracted in the license. We'll talk about risk and value. We'll talk about valuation methodologies. We'll talk about cost, industry standards or comparables, rules of thumb, equity. And that'll be our topic for today. So, valuation. What do we mean by valuation? What do you mean? How do you set a value on something? Let's say, we talked yesterday about the analogies of licensing with your housing situation. So, let's say you own a house and you want to sell the house. How do you go about setting the price for the house? I bought the house I'm living in now and giving this lecture from in 1983. And since my wife and I have owned it, we have put we've done two major additions. So I don't think that the price I paid for this house in 1983 is remotely relevant to what I would ask for this house if I were to put it on the market today. Rather, today, I would probably look at other houses in the town I live in of comparable size, as many bedrooms, as many bathrooms, as big an area of land, etc., and what they had sold for recently, and I would base my asking price on that. So when we come to intellectual property, there are various techniques. They probably give you different answers. But at the end of the day, they're an opinion. Just because I have looked at these comparable houses in my town and set my value doesn't necessarily mean that that's the price I'm going to get. The market might be depressed. There may be too many properties on the market because interest rates are high, and so I'll get less than the value I've set on it. Or, as we found in the US during the pandemic, houses in suburbs like I live in have become very attractive, and prices are high, and houses are being sold for more than the asking price. You have bidding wars. So your value at the end of the day is an opinion. Pricing, on the other hand, is what we settle at. The seller and the buyer, where they come to a meeting point. And so pricing is the result of a negotiation. There is one outcome, and at the end, there's a commitment. When somebody wants to buy my house and we've agreed on a price and the other terms, they will sign a contract and they will pay me money. They are now legally committed to going ahead with this purchase. And the first fundamental takeaway I want you to take from this lecture is that if you have a rational basis for your valuation, then you will negotiate what those bases are. I tell the person who wants to buy my house, here are 3 other houses with as many bedrooms and as many bathrooms and a comparable size lot that have sold in the last 6 months in this town. So here's what I want. And they will come back and say, yeah, I understand that. But if you look at them, the one that was oldest sold for most, and the one that was sold next sold for less, and the one that sold less that sold most recently sold for less. So I think the market's coming down. So I'm going to offer you a little less than you are asking for. That's a rational negotiation. If you don't have a valuation basis, you negotiate from emotion. So I'm going to tell you a story. You may remember when I was introduced yesterday, you were told that I had spent 17 years at Boston University. And before that, I had spent 4 years at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. And that was my first foray into academic technology transfer. I had spent about 9 or 10 years in academic license, in biotech. But the technologies that we were working on weren't licensed from universities. We had a license to the basic Cohen-Boyer patents from Stanford that all genetic engineering companies needed back then. But the specific technologies were based on know-how, on our own ideas. So I get to Dana-Farber, and I find in the inbox, I clearly have a hot technology. Now, what is the definition of a hot academic technology? Lita Nelson, who ran tech transfer at MIT for 30 years, once said, a hot academic technology is one that 2 companies are interested in. We talked, I think, a little bit yesterday about how you only license about a quarter of the inventions you get, about half of the patents you file when you have a well-staffed, fully functioning office. That's what Lita was joking about when she said, if 2 companies are interested in a technology, it's hot. Well, I must have had a white hot technology because I had 3 companies that were interested. 1 in Massachusetts, 2 in California. So one of the California companies was going to fly to Boston and send a team in to sit down and talk with us. And so I had to be ready to make a proposal to them. Well, I had no idea what to ask for, what terms were normal and customary, what the value of this technology was. So from my time in biotech, I knew various people in pharmaceutical licensing. So I called them up. And by the way, my technology was a cell surface adhesion molecule, L-selectin. In the early 1990s, these were very important molecules. The inventor was Tom Tedder, who's now at Duke University. And so I said, here's my molecule, L-selectin. These people seem very interested. What should I ask for it? And they all said, beats me. So I'd already got to know a few people in academic licensing. So I called them up, said, L-selectin, lots of people want it. What do I ask for it? And they said, beats me. So the company was coming in and they sent 2 people, I think, business development and a lawyer. And we sat down, and after the normal pleasantries about how baseball was going, they said, so we're very interested in this L-selectin molecule, and we'd like to discuss licensing terms with you. What are your thoughts on what you want to see for this? Well, I had to pluck a number from the air, which I did, and I put it on the table, and they looked at me as if I had 2 heads. And they said, why do you think it's worth that much? And I said, well, we think this is a very important molecule. And they said, yes, so do we. That's why we're here. But why do you think it's worth that much? And I had no answer to them. All I could say was, well, we think this is a very important molecule. And they said, yeah, we've agreed that. But what's your basis for that proposal? Where'd you get those numbers from? And all I could say was, well, we think this is a very important molecule. And they thanked me politely, got up and flew back to California. And I never could get them back to the negotiating table. They thought we were just irrational people. Luckily, I had two other people tucked up my sleeve, and I was able to do a deal with one of them. And so I didn't get fired. Tom Tedder was a highly regarded young scientist, and if I had completely messed up the one opportunity to license his L-selectin, I would undoubtedly have been fired. But as it was, I was able to do a deal with somebody else, and Tom and I have remained good friends. So I took a lesson from this. I said, there has to be a better way to value technologies. And I set out to learn what I could about valuation. Now, in my defense, the first book on licensing, evaluation in licensing, didn't come out till 1998. It was Richard Razgatis's book on valuing technologies, 1998. So where did I go to learn valuation techniques? Well, there were really 4 annual conferences on licensing back then. Autumn, the Association of University Technology Managers, had 2 annual meetings, one in the spring, one in the winter, one in the summer. And there was the Licensing Executive Society. Well, academic licensing people didn't know much about valuation then, so I went to all of the LES meetings, and any workshop that had the word valuation in its title, there I was sitting in the front row. So let's think about this. When do you value technology? So this slide took me about 2 to 3 years to realize the philosophical background, the basis for this slide. Because when I went and sat in these workshops on valuation, I was getting more confused, not less. These people were talking about things like the excess return on intangible assets. And I'm thinking, here's my L-selectin. How do I measure the excess return on this intangible asset? I was getting more confused, not less. And one day there was a lady from Sandoz sitting in the row behind me. This is before the Sandoz-Ciba-Geigy merger to form Novartis. And so I leant back and I said to her, do you use this valuation technique? And she said, no, I thought, maybe it's just we academic people, we don't know what we're doing. Maybe industry people are much better trained and they know how to do this. And she said to me, I don't even understand the terms he's using. And I felt much better. And I slowly came to realize that what this man was talking about was what I call retrospective technology valuation, done in litigation. Well, when do you litigate over intellectual property? Only when it's been successful, there are products in the market, and there's lots and lots and lots of money to fight over. And the difference between this and licensing is that in litigation, you have this wonderful process called discovery, when each side writes to the other side and says, I want all the information you have on this, this, and this, the information that is relevant to allowing them to build their case. And they supply that information. And if they're ever found to have concealed or destroyed relevant information, then people, the lawyers responsible will be disbarred and will never practice law again. So we take this very, very seriously. And in litigation, you establish the value of the technology at a point in time, and you pay in a lump sum. And it's an adversarial process. The judge and the jury will decide, A, whether you've infringed the intellectual property, and if so, how much you will pay. And you can appeal, but at the end of the day, you will pay what the legal system says. Well, compare that with what we do in licensing. We are valuing the technology prospectively, in advance. It's being done by deal makers. There's an asymmetry of information. We probably know more about the technology, and the people who want to license it probably know more about the markets and the value. And as we discussed yesterday, when we looked at the structure of license agreements, the financial structure of license agreements, we don't get paid a single lump sum payment, but rather we establish a mechanism to extract the value of the technology over time, because the technology, we said, doesn't have a constant value. It has a low value at the beginning, and the value rises as the technology's potential is demonstrated by the efforts of the licensee doing their development work. And it has to be a win-win situation, because we talked about we're going to form a relationship, a partnership that's going to last probably for 20 years if the technology is successful. And so what do we mean by a valuation? A written analysis of what we believe the value of a technology to be. And I think you need to be prepared to give it to the other side, identify the sources of the data, discuss the data, potentially modify your discussions based on your discussions with the other side. They may say, no, your data's wrong. Here's some better numbers for that, a better estimate for the size of the market, and so forth. And perhaps they might even say, no, for a technology at this stage, that's the wrong method to use for your valuation. We should use this approach. And a license valuation, we mean constructing the various financial elements of a proposed license, the upfront payments, ongoing commercial payments, patent costs, milestone payments, annual minimum royalties, research support, sub-license income sharing, perhaps there's any manufacturing, and then the earned royalties or the sales and profit sharing. In other words, the term sheet. So the next thing I want to talk to you about is the concept of risk. We've been talking about this to a certain extent already. There's all sorts of risk in developing a new technology. There's an R&D risk. Now, it may not work. And if you're developing a drug, there's the risk that you'll find that your product isn't safe, there's too high a side effect profile, or that it's not as effective as what's out there. So you won't get approval. If you're developing electronic technologies, there's a standards risk. You may be going in one direction and the IEEE sets up a standard for doing that, and your technology is not compatible with it. There's a manufacturability risk. You may not be able to manufacture your technology at an acceptable cost that the market will bear. There's a marketing risk. You may have a very, very good technology, but you're a small company and you get out-marketed by a big company. We can think about, most people accept that the Apple computer system, operating system, is better than the Microsoft Windows system. But Microsoft and Windows has the share of the market just because Microsoft was a bigger company than Apple and could out-market them back in the early 1980s and early 1990s. There's a competitive risk. You may be approaching it one way and another company comes along with a different approach and that is successful. There's a legal risk, a patent risk. The world has got more rational, but when I got into this business in the US, patent applications were confidential and they weren't published. And you only got to see what happened when a patent got issued. You might have some idea of what was going on from foreign filings, but there was a complete crapshoot. You could be getting your product to market and suddenly a patent issued to somebody and you were completely blocked. We changed that in 2001 in the US, and now US patent applications are published. But I'll give you an example of this. Merck was developing a biosimilar version of one of Amgen's anti-inflammatory drugs, one of its TNF blockers. And suddenly, they submit it to the FDA for approval, and suddenly Amgen got a patent issued that nobody knew about. Because when we changed the law in 1995, any application filed before then remained confidential till it issued. And so this patent had been sitting around for about 15 years in the patent office, and they suddenly issued it, and Merck was blocked from the market, and they took a $700 million write-off that day because they knew all the money they'd invested in developing this biosimilar was completely wasted. It was irrational, and I think things are a lot more rational now. When you put this all together, overall, only 1 in 10,000 drug candidates makes it to FDA approval. Only 1 in 3,000 raw ideas make it to market. And 1/3 to 2/3 of new product launches by sophisticated, big consumer products companies, up to 2/3 of their new products fail to recoup the investment they made in developing them. That's a very scary number. And this is probably the second most important takeaway from this talk. First takeaway, have a basis for your valuation. Second takeaway is the importance of risk. And value and risk are inversely related. As risk goes down, value goes up. So we are licensing a technology here at the very earliest stages of the technology's life. And so the value, the risk is highest, so the value is lowest. And as we've been talking about for the last 2 days, as the licensee develops the technology and starts testing the market, the risk goes down, and therefore the value goes up. And so I said, this is a fundamental principle of license valuation. I said, we don't get paid a lump sum upfront, and we probably shouldn't even try to get paid upfront in full, because the value will be at the low point at that point. And our job is to develop a contractual basis that extracts the value from the technology over time, so that we share in the growth in that value. I'm going to tell you an example. It's an American story. I don't know whether you in India are familiar with and have this sports drink called Gatorade. It's been around since the early 1960s. It's a sports drink. It was the first drink designed to rehydrate athletes. It's very simple. It is basically glucose and salt combined with colorings and flavorings to make that taste less like seawater, which is what salt and glucose, which is a very unsweet sugar, tastes like. It was invented by a urologist, Robert Cade, at the University of Florida. And he offered the rights to a company called Stokely Van Camp for $1 million. And the rights consisted of patent applications, a trade secret formula, We talked about a trade secret with Listerine. This would not have been a very profound trade secret. Salt and glucose. Most people would have been able to work out what that was. And most importantly, a trademark. The University of Florida's mascot is an alligator or a gator. And so he incorporated that in the name of this drink. And Stokely Van Camp, and he was actually negotiating with Alfred Stokely, the grandson of the founder. He said, no, I really can't do that. He said, to test the market for this crazy drink, which there's nothing like it out there, we have no idea if people will buy it, that test market's going to cost me at least $1 million. So if I pay you $1 million, I'm going to double my financial risk. I can't do that. So what I'll do instead is I'll pay you royalties. And to date, Stokely, who got bought by Quaker Oats, who got bought by Pepsi Cola, have paid over $1 billion in royalties for Gatorade. And I think everybody's happy. Stokely Van Camp made an enormous amount of money from it, and the University of Florida's made an enormous amount of money. By the way, they didn't make $1 billion. There was an ugly lawsuit, and Robert Cade owned it, got sued by the University of Florida because they refused to take on the technology. So he did it himself. And when he got this deal with Stokely Van Camp, they sued him. And the resolution was that he got 80% of the money and the university got 20%. So he created a trust for the various people who helped him. And the $800 million went into that. So that's the importance of risk in licensing. So let's talk about some of the basic ways to approach valuation. And this is what a licensing person says. You can look at the cost. There are rules of thumb. There are industry standards. There are comparables. There's a ranking and rating method. There's discounted cash flow approaches. There's a Monte Carlo approach. You can auction off these technologies. Common sense is another way. This was a story about a patent that covered the Group 3 fax machines owned by Iowa State University. And they charged a royalty of 0.875% of the sales of Group 3 fax machines. And when asked why it was 0.875%, they said, well, we knew that 1% would never fly. People would never pay that. So we pitched it just below 1%. That's what I look at as a very common sense approach. And I was once talking about this in a lecture I was giving at, I think, LES, and one of these litigation valuation people put their hand up and said, I don't think there's any room for common sense in valuing technologies. And everybody laughed, and I don't think he meant it that way. And then equity in startup companies is another way you can value technology. Today, I'm going to talk about cost, rules of thumb, industry standards and comparables, and equity. So you can look back and look at the cost to develop a technology. So your thinking here is, I know what it cost me to develop the technology, and if I get a return on that investment, I'll be happy. Now, the question is the cost to develop it relevant? I said at the beginning, the cost I pay to buy my house and the amount of money I've invested in doing my 2 big additions isn't really relevant to what the value of the technology is today. You know, ask yourself, would you want to or be able to sell a used lottery ticket for what you paid for it? You know, if it's a winning lottery ticket, then you want much more than you paid for it. And if it's a losing lottery ticket, then it's worth scrap paper. And in the academic context, most university research is done funded by grants from somebody. So your licensee might say, but it didn't cost you anything. You got a grant. To which your answer is yes. And the people who gave me that grant want to make sure that I get a good return on their investment. I think there are three areas where cost enters a license negotiations. For academic institutions, one of the first things we always put on the table is, here's how much I spent on the patents. I want that back up front. And let's say that you've jointly developed a technology with another institution, and you're trying to decide what your relative ownership percentage is. I would argue that looking at how much you each invested in developing the technology would be a pretty defensible way to allocate that. But let's think about how a cost-driven negotiation might work. Let's say you're the seller and you say, look, it cost me $50,000 to develop this technology, and I want to double that. I want to get 100% return on that. So this technology is worth $100,000 to me. Now, from the buyer's point of view, let's see, he says, well, if I don't license from you, but I have to develop my own technology, that's going to cost me $40,000. I'm going to have to license in patents from other people to be able to practice that. That's another $40,000. And it's going to take me 2 years, and the delay to the market is worth another $40,000. So this technology is worth $120,000 to me. So you only want $100,000? Great deal. Sign me up. Now, somebody else might say, nah, I can develop a replacement technology in a year for $20,000, much lower in licensing costs, another $20,000, and it's only a 1 year delay. I'll value that at $20,000. So this technology, you want $100,000? No, it's only worth $60,000 to me. No deal. I'll go do it myself. Now, one of the big benefits of doing a cost-based valuation is you always know those numbers. And as I said earlier, always have a basis for your valuation, and you always know what it cost you to develop the technologies. So a couple of cost-based valuations. You may remember yesterday I said that in the US, we can't set, because of tax laws, we can't set license terms in advance before technologies are invented. And that does cause friction with companies who want to pay for research and not know what their cost is going to be to them to license it afterwards. So the University of Minnesota and Penn State University have research models in which the sponsor can get a fully paid up license for an extra 10% of the research costs. And that is 10% of the fully loaded costs, including the indirect cost or overhead costs. And there are various foundations in the US and in other parts of the world that are very interested in specific diseases and raise money from charitable, from the public to develop solutions for these diseases. And they demand royalties in return for their funding. And the royalties are typically capped at 2 times the amount that the foundation has invested in the entity that developed the technology. So the next technique I want to talk about is what I call look out your hand, rules of thumb. And we talked yesterday briefly about the 25% rule. The Goldscheider principle, also known as the 25% rule, and I gave you this statement yesterday. So Goldscheider based this rule on empirical observations. He had been hired by the Swiss subsidiary of a US television company called Philco, starting in 1959. Philco was the leading American television company then. You've never heard the name, right? Because now it's all Sony and Samsung and people like that, so they lost their lead. But they made the most sophisticated televisions at the time. They didn't want to license those inventions to their American competitors because they wanted to keep those special features to distinguish their televisions and sell them at a higher price and make more money in the US. But they were happy to license the technologies outside the US. And they did that through this Swiss subsidiary. And the package that Goldscheider was given to license was a complete intellectual property portfolio. Patents, ongoing know-how that Philco was developing. They had trademarked, they had copyrighted product materials. And these licenses were for 3 years. So you can imagine that if you find the license is burdensome, you can say, well, this is really good technology. I really want to stay working with this company. So I can suck it up for 3 years and then renegotiate the terms to a more viable basis in 3 years' time when the license expires. And they were making a 20% pre-tax profit and paying Philco a 5% royalty. And they were all number one or number two in their market, despite strong competition. And they happily renewed the licenses on these terms. And so Goldscheider concluded that the licenses resulted in successful long-term win-win relationships. And so this was the basis for this 25% rule. And it's important to remember that you apply it to fully loaded pre-tax profits, not the gross margin. So this establishes a fundamental relationship between the profitability of a product and the royalties that should be paid for that technology. Now, you want to express, as I said yesterday, your royalty terms as a percent of net sales in a license. You should be very, very cautious about expressing it as in terms of profits. So your royalty rate should be 25% times your expected profit margin. And it's a starting point for negotiation. I have generally found it to be of limited value in academic licensing negotiations because of the early stage. We really don't know what the products will sell for. We don't know what the products will cost to make. I found it to be very helpful when you're licensing to a new industry. You can look at the economics of that industry and decide what the profit margins are likely to be, and hence what the royalties are likely to be. So, software, very profitable, high royalty rates. Pharmaceuticals, very profitable, high royalty rates. Cars, way low profitability, low royalty rates, and so on. What I'm going to spend most of the time talking about today is industry standards, comparables. Going back to my analogy of selling my house, this is saying, okay, what I paid for the house in 1983 and what I paid in 1991 and 2010 to do big additions isn't relevant. What's relevant is what other houses like mine have sold for. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to look up what other people have licensed technologies for? So I think it's the most important valuation method in academic licensing. It's very important in corporate licensing too. I don't know if it's still the case, but on 2 occasions, I heard Merck say that in their license deals, they only use comparable transactions to value them until phase 3. When something's done a phase 3 trial, then they will do a bottom-up valuation methodology. Up till then, they just use comparables. So where do you go to look up comparable transactions? In the US, real estate transactions are all recorded in public registries of deeds. So you can go look them up. And there are databases now. Zillow is the most well-known, that will give you a value of any house in the US based on its size and facilities as recorded in its tax records, and then correlating those tax records with sales that are occurring in that community. Where do you get that for intellectual property? Well, there's an internal database. There are some published surveys. There are public announcements. There's word of mouth. There's litigation. And then what I'm going to spend most time talking about is what I call required disclosure. So internal database, this is the licenses previously done by your organization. Now, this will obviously be of limited value if you're a brand new licensing organization, but if you're MIT or Harvard or Stanford or BU who've been doing tech transfer for 40 years, you've done a lot of deals and you know what you've been able to achieve in those deals. So, let's say you've got antibodies to license for research purposes. And 5 years ago, you did a deal and got a 5% royalty. And then a year or so later, you did another deal and you got 6%. And a year later, you did another deal and got 7%. It's pretty clear that you're not hitting the maximum you can get for an antibody for research purposes. Published surveys, they are relatively few in number, and most are really, really old. And there are some good recent surveys done by the Licensing Executive Society. They've done biopharmaceutical royalty rates and deal terms. I think there's even one I haven't got here, 2018. I think they do them about every 2 years. They've done one chemicals, energy, environmental, and materials survey, and they've done a couple of high-tech surveys. I really think that any serious licensing organization should have at least one person who's a member of LES. First, to get access to these surveys, and second, to get access to the LES membership directory, because people in licensing, in the Licensing Executive Society, are people whose job it is to return phone calls and emails when people call them about potential new technologies. So here's some stuff from their 2016 biopharmaceutical. They had 165 responses, of which 117 were complete and were used. Oncology, central nervous system, and infectious diseases were the categories that were most common. 84% of the deals were exclusive. 87% included the US and 80% were global. 55% were from before the investigational new drug application, so before clinical trials were being started. This is really important because in academia, that's what our technologies are. They're all early stage, so very useful for universities. A lot of them covered pretty small product. For a drug, $500 million is a pretty low selling drug these days. And the royalty structure was 62% had fixed royalties, and 27% had tiered royalties, and 9% had no royalty, and one had a profit share. 1% had a profit sharing mechanism. 8% were fixed fees, no royalties. And here's what they found. they categorize the technologies into 4 groups, and proof of principle, which is phase 2. Phase 1 is just safety and top maximum tolerated dose, and it's only in phase 2 that you start to see efficacy. And so you can see this is proof of concept in phase 2, and look at how the royalties change. Group 1, the earliest, 4.5, group 2, 6.3, and they jump up to 14%. So this is a classic demonstration of that risk return curve I talked about earlier. And then you can see at the end here how many deals they had, and the median and the minimum and the maximum royalties that were reported. And looking at flat versus tiered royalties versus the stage of development, you can see that for group 1, preclinical, group 2, before proof of concept, if they were tiered, they started above the flat rate. If it was post proof of concept, the lowest tier was below the flat rate, and then the later ones were above. And I think typically there were 3 tiers, a nice market size, a bigger one, and then a blockbuster market size. Autumn does have a database. It's called Transact, launched in 2015. It's just academic deals, and you have to, you can contribute your own deals and then get free access to it, or you can pay for access. I'm afraid, although I was involved in its creation, it has severe limitations. The subject matter must be selected from a pick list, and all healthcare is the same code. So if you want to value a drug, they all come out together. So a search for a small molecule drug gave you 80 hits, of which 26 had royalty rates. But you can't download all the data into a spreadsheet for analysis. You have to do them one by one. It's very irritating, and I think it really limits the value of the Transact database. And I think it's probably going to be most helpful for non-healthcare technologies. But I'm going to spend most of my time on required disclosure. This is a uniquely American phenomenon. I don't know of any other country that requires its publicly traded companies to publicly disclose as much business information about their license transactions as we do in the US. But it's all accessible to everybody worldwide. And the information is contained in filings that companies make to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. Now, for this to work, the company has to be publicly traded, because those are the companies that have to file with the SEC, or it has to have filed to go public, because in the preparation process, it has to submit all this data. And even if the company turns out to be unattractive to the public markets, and the investment bankers say, sorry, guys, we can't sell your stock, you're not going to go public, those documents remain in the public domain. And the documents are contained in exhibits to the S1, which is the initial public offering document, the 10K, the annual report, the 10Q, the quarterly reports, or the 8Ks, which are reports companies submit if a material event occurs during a quarter. Now, the disclosure is only required for transactions that are deemed material to the company's financial health. And that is defined as something that impacts 10% of the company's sales or 5% of its assets. What that means is For a small company doing a deal with a big company, this will undoubtedly be material for the small company. It likely won't be material for the big company. So you're going to find the details of this in the SEC filings of the small company. And you can redact commercially sensitive information, such as license terms, from public disclosure. And people routinely do. And certainly since we transitioned to electronic filing with the advent of the internet, redaction has increased. But the redaction is only good for 5 years. And after 5 years, you can write to the SEC and say, okay, give me the good stuff now, confidentiality has expired. And there are some databases that are really, really good at going back and getting the unredacted data 5 years later. So how do you go about applying this? Well, you've got to identify a comparable transaction that would be a helpful model. A deal somewhat like yours, an antibody, a gene therapy, whatever it is. And you do that, by searching the web with certain key terms, and you'll find deals. Then you need to determine if the agreement has been filed with the SEC. And then you find it. Simple, right? So how do you get SEC filings yourself? Well, the SEC created this system called EDGAR, which I think stands for Electronic Data Gathering and Retrieval System. That's its URL. It's a lot more user-friendly these days. If you go back to early filings, you'll see them hard-coded in HTML code. They're pretty ugly, but you can search them using your web browser and you'll find the good stuff. These days, they come up in proper format. Companies were phased in progressively. The largest were required to report in January 1994. Think about that. Really, the internet got started in a big way in mid-1993 with the release of Mosaic 3.0, the first web browser that could display graphics. So within 6 months, the SEC had said this will revolutionize filing of company information. And there was an intermediate step, and then the smallest companies had to start electronic filing in May of 1996. So this means that there's now 25 years worth of data out there. And if you want to go back even before then, their early 10Ks will show whether or when a particular deal was filed. So how do you find these comparables? If you're looking for technologies, there's a database called Royalty Source, there's Tech Agreements, Royalty Stat, Business Valuation Resources. In life sciences, there's Clarivate, which used to be called Recap. There's Bioscience Advisors. There's IQVIA, which used to be Pharma Deals. And the Strategic Transactions, which used to be called Windhover Publications. Now, all of these charge either per agreement or an annual subscription, and those annual subscriptions are not cheap. But some let you identify agreements before you have to pay. And then you can find them yourself using the SEC system. So, no-cost search strategies. You can search using Tech Agreements for physical sciences or Windhover for life sciences, and then find the agreements using the SEC. High-cost life sciences, you search and get agreements using Clarivate or Bioscience Advisors. Those are the best two, I think. And alternative, you can use a consultant for a specific technology, and they will typically charge you $2,000 to $3,000 because they have a subscription to one of these databases. So let's look at an example. Let's say we have a small interfering RNA technology. And the tools we're going to use are Clarivate and EDGAR. So this is what the Clarivate search interface looks like. I used to have a subscription to this, and you can see I use my subscription here. This is what the interface looked like. And I put my search term siRNA up here, and I hit go. And I get a screen comes up that looks like this. How do I get this? Sorry, there we go. That's my search term. And you can see I got 548 results. And look at this button that I can hit and download all those results into a spreadsheet. And here's the spreadsheet that comes up. The deal title, the principal company, and what type of company it is, pharma, biotech, other non-industrial, academic. So there are 36 fields in this database, and they cover things like the partners, the technology, the legal components of the deal. Now, is there an option? Is there a license? Is there research? Is there equity? Things like that. The financial terms of the deal and access to the actual documents, the stage of development. So in my siRNA, I had 548 deals, 109 had some financial information, 25 had royalty information, 164 of the 548 were public sector research institutions, hospitals, universities, government laboratories. 122 were academic, 13 were government agency, and 29 were not-for-profit hospitals or non-profit research institutes. 41 of this 164 had some financial information, and 6 had royalty information ranging from 1 to 10%. 6 had the actual license agreement available. 4 of them, it was unredacted. 2, it was redacted. So these were the ones I came across. And this one looked kind of interesting. The University of Illinois doing a deal with a company called Acuity. You can see it was done in August 2006. The total value of the deal was $2.5 million, $30,000 up front, $2.45 million in milestone payments, and a 3% royalty. This Clarivate system started out its life as a system called Recombinant Capital, or RECAP, created by a man called Mark Edwards, who worked briefly for the Stanford Tech Transfer Office. And this database has been repeatedly sold and reformatted. And in the Clarivate, the unredacted copy of the agreement was available, but only the redacted version is available in Clarivate. And what I show you next comes from the earlier days. And I've since changed my subscription to a new database created by Mark Edwards called Bioscience Advisors, which I think is now vastly superior to Clarivate. So this is one of the things you can get, a kind of picture of the deal. University of Illinois, Acuity, and here's the terms, and here's the details. It's the TGF-beta expression by siRNA for ophthalmic diseases. You'll often find a lot of new technologies first get used in treating eye diseases. And the reason being that if you're treating a disease inside the eyeball, you don't have to worry about systemic effects, the side effects your drug might have on other organs in the body. And they also gave you a summary of the deal in which they abstract key provisions and put them in this standard format. So here is research and development, cost sharing, et cetera, et cetera. And then here is the actual agreement itself. Technology license agreement between the Board of Trustees of the University of Illinois and Acuity Pharmaceuticals. And you go down to Article 3, and here's the royalty provisions, the royalty terms, milestone payments, and a little lower down the running royalty rate. And you can find in the database that there was a reverse merger with this company to form Opto Health. So we look up Opto Health in the Edgar system. Here's what this looks like. And out comes this 8K. And this 8K here in 2007, April 2007, was when they filed this license agreement. And the licenses are in the attachments, the exhibits to this 8K. And you can see all these technology license agreements that they're filing here. And you can see each one has a link that you can click through, and there they are. So this is that one I was just showing you, Board of Trustees of the University of Illinois. And we go down, and there's those self-same license terms that we saw from the Clarivate database now in the SEC files. Now, if you read the deal, you'll see that the University of Illinois got stock in Acuity as part of the deal. And so we can see, put an estimate on the value of that deal. We can go to the company's 10Q, its most recent quarterly filing, to get the number of shares outstanding. And I use the NASDAQ database to get the stock price. So here's their 10Q. And at the bottom here, you can see they had 615 million shares outstanding. Sounds an awful lot for a relatively young company. And here's the NASDAQ database looking up the value of that stock. And here's what it was worth on the day I did the analysis, $2.37, $2.37 a share. And here's how that had fluctuated during the course of the day. And here's a chart showing the 1 year price valuation. It had gone from like $6 down to about $2. So, you know, hope we didn't have too much of that in our retirement portfolio. And you can pull up a 10-year history, and you can see it started out at 2, hit about, 18 or so briefly, and then back down to 2. So a lot of people made a lot of money, and a lot of people lost a lot of money on this stock in its lifetime. But on the day we did the analysis, the value of the company is almost $1.5 billion, 615 million multiplied by $2.37 gives you about $1.5 billion. And if the University of Illinois still owned 3%, it would be worth 43 million. I don't think they owned anything like that because they did that deal at an early stage of the company. There had been the merger, other financings, etc. I'm sure they owned much less than 3% by the time we did this calculation. Now, there is a newer way to use SEC filings. Companies seem to be making much more detailed disclosures of their deal terms in their 10Ks these days, in the actual annual report itself. And these are much easier to find and search than attached agreements. So I'll give you an example where I had a consulting contract with an Asian university, which was developing a cellular therapy. And the model I used was chimeric antigen receptor T cells, or CAR Ts, very hot area of cancer treatment. And some of the leading US companies were called Juno Therapeutics, who's now been bought by Celgene, who got bought by Bristol Myers Squibb. And they had 5 academic stage deal terms identified. Oops. So one was with the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center, had an upfront payment of $250,000. That's a lot of money for an academic technology. Annual maintenance fee of $50,000 for the first 4 years, and thereafter an annual minimum royalty of $100,000 a year. Milestone payments of $6.75 million per licensed product for 2 identified products. Low single-digit royalties. What does that mean? I think low single-digit is 3 to 4%. Mid single-figure digits would be maybe 4 to 6%. High single-digit royalties would probably be 7 to 9%. So here, even though the license agreements were redacted, they're disclosing a lot of the information in the written 10K. And then they got a portion of payments from sub-licensees. There was a deal with Memorial Sloan Kettering, 6.9 upfront, $100,000 annual minimum royalties starting on the 5th anniversary, mid to high single-digit royalties on annual sales, which is probably, I would say, tiered 5 to 9%. $6.75 million in clinical and regulatory milestones for this product, JCAR 015. Seattle Children's Research Institute, $200,000 upfront, $50,000 for the first 5 years, $200,000 thereafter. Low single-digit royalties, 2 to 4% for the same products that we saw earlier. So this is stacked. Milestone payments totaling up to $3.3 million. That'll be on top of what Fred Hutchinson got, and $3 million in commercial milestone payments, sales milestones, and then a percentage of sub-license payments. So this was additive to the Fred Hutchinson. St. Jude's, $25 million upfront, low single-digit royalties, and then the same sort of things. Again, these same 2 products. So there was a lawsuit. Juno, who licensed the technology from Memorial Sloan Kettering, sued Kite over Kite's drug Yescarta, which was the first chimeric antigen receptor T-cell. It got approved in October 2017. The patent was that number, expires in May 2023. Now, Kite got bought by Gilead for $11.9 billion just before this lawsuit got filed. And Juno got bought by Celgene for $9 billion in January 2018, just after the lawsuit was filed. And then Celgene, a year later, got bought by Bristol Myers Squibb for $74 billion. You can see these chimeric antigen receptor T cells created enormous value for academic institutions and for the companies that license from them. As I said, Yescarta got approved in October 2017, and so that's why Juno and Sloan Kettering sued, because you don't sue unless there's a lot of money to be worth fighting over, and there's no money to fight over for a drug until it gets approved by the FDA. And it was approved for relapsed or refractory large B-cell lymphoma. Its 2019 sales were $489 million. That, from being launched in 2017, that's pretty good. And the forecast for 2022 was $1.47 billion. And in the resolution of the lawsuit, Bristol Myers, which by now owned Juno, was awarded $752 million in damages in December 2019. Now, we can build a model of this. So here's the model I built for Yescarta's sales. I got the 2017, 2018, 2019 sales from Juno's SEC filings and then Bristol Myers. And then I got these figures, the forecast for 2020, 21, 22, and 23, by taking that forecast of 1.47 billion in 2026 and doing a linear extrapolation. And then I applied the 7% royalties that we got from the what they said about the Sloan Kettering deal in their 10K. And you can see 7% of each of these numbers. And then I discounted them using an 11% discount rate. And I did this calculation in 2019. So for the earlier year sales, I increased them. And for the later year sales, I decreased them. And by the way, this 2023 lower than 2022 is because the patent expired in May of 2023. And so I use these discount factors, and that I multiply the royalties by the discount factor, and now I get the value of those royalties in 2019. And you can see the total value of those royalties is $279 million. But we know that the answer was $752 million. And so using the solution-seeking function of Excel, I can say, what royalty rate does it take for the value of these royalties to be $752 million? And the answer is 18.9%. So how do we reconcile this? Juno's said that their MSK license was 5 to 9%, and I use 7%. The answer from litigation was 18.9%. Why? Well, in litigation, the patent is presumed to be valid and infringed, whereas when you're licensing it, you don't know if it will withstand challenge. There's uncertainty as to validity. Secondly, in litigation, the royalty is determined on the eve of infringement, which is the later of patent issuance and product launch. And in this case, it was product launch because the patent was out there. So the license is done at a much earlier stage, and we've looked at several examples now of how the later the stage of development, the higher the royalty rates. So royalty rates for marketed products are much higher than for clinical or phase 1 products. So that's what I want to talk about on comparable transactions. They're enormously important. You can do a lot of the work yourself with a minimal amount of searching and resources. The last one I'm going to talk about today is equity. That is when you extract value by licensing to a startup. In most countries, the university gets an ownership stake when it licenses technology to a startup company instead of an upfront fee. And then there are normal other royalty terms, milestone payments, running royalties, etc. The philosophy is that a startup has very little money. You want that money to be going into developing the technology. And as the company is successful, they'll raise more money, and then they can start to pay you much more like a normal, mature company. Now, we found in Asia there are fairness and corruption concerns about equity. So I have a standard formula for the distribution of initial equity in a startup company. The inventor gets 25% of the equity, and for that, they get to spend 1 day a week on helping this company. In Europe and the US, academic employment contracts allow the professor to spend 1 day a week on external activities and to keep any money they get from that. That is not the case we found in academic employment agreements in emerging countries. It's very important to have the professor as part of the company, able to help it. So this is to get that above board. The university gets 25%, part of the license consideration, to compensate it for the professor's time and to give the company use of an office space for 1 year. The management team of the company gets 25% to provide them with an incentive to work with the company. And then the investors get 25% for a $50,000 investment, which values the company at $200,000. That is my model. I think it's rational. Remember I said, always have a basis for your valuation. And you can see I got a reason for all of these shares here. And, I put this out to you as a model for you to think about in your deals. So we're seeing half goes to the university and half goes to the private sector. UK model, they have an even split between the professor and the university. Columbia University's model is a standard equity model for every startup, for all sectors. The royalty terms vary by sector. So the royalties are higher for software and pharmaceuticals, lower for engineering and manufacturing, where it depends on the profitability. And I didn't put what the Columbia standard terms are. They are 5% ownership for Columbia, and they get to stay at 5% until the company raises a Series A round that is typical for the industry sector in which it's at. And Columbia has found by having these standard terms that apply to everybody, it enormously facilitates their negotiation of startups with their faculty, because professors are insistent on getting the same deal as somebody else. They don't want to be screwed and get worse terms than somebody else. So this standard model has really helped Columbia. So as more investors are brought in, more shares are issued, everybody gets diluted. As more employees are brought in, they typically get shares, and so more shares are issued. Everybody gets diluted some more. Okay, so that's what I'm going to talk about valuation methodologies. And if all else fails, 5% in healthcare at least, maybe 2% in other things. It's a very traditional academic formula, and I found its history. I found it in this deal between the University of Toronto and Eli Lilly Company in called an indenture, this 20th day of May, 1922. I love that concept of an indentured servant. And here's a royalty rate of 5%. And I wonder if any of you can guess what this license is applying to. It's a 1-year license. But University of Toronto, 1923, this was the license to insulin that was discovered at the University of Toronto, got the Nobel Prize 3 years later, transformed the treatment of diabetes. And it was the thing that launched Eli Lilly from being a manufacturer of fine chemicals to being a major pharmaceutical company. The other approach you can use is what I call list pricing. As you get more familiar with tech transfer and do more deals, you'll have a good feel for what each technology is worth. You won't need to go through a specific valuation exercise for each one. So here's some resources. A lot of this talk, including much more detail on that discounted cash flow analysis I did, and much more detail on how equity models and cap tables of companies change as they raise financing. You'll find this in the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO. They hired me and paid me a good sum of money to take my full valuation talks, 2 of them, and translate them into this intellectual property valuation manual for academic institutions. That's the URL, or you can just go to the WIPO website and put my name into the search bar and it comes up. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I hope that's been helpful, and perhaps we can take some questions.
Thank you, Ashley. I think Pragna has put up a feedback form, so I'll request people who are attending to please fill up that as well. Let me just take a few questions here, Ashley. There are some. Pragna, you also might have received some. So, do you want to go first?
Sure, sir. Most of them are in public chat only, so none I
Okay.
received on private. So maybe
Okay.
I can start first if you want.
Yeah, I think let's go with this question on, there's a question about what is the ideal proportion for upfront milestone and royalties in biological sciences? And how do you decide how much should be upfront, how much should be milestones, and how much should be royalties?
Well, as we looked at yesterday, the upfront, and we saw in those examples of the chimeric antigen receptor T cells I showed you from Juno, that the upfront is lower than the milestone payments, because the milestone payments are paid as the technology is going through successive stages of clinical development, and so its value is going up.
Is there any proportion? For example, I've seen a number like if you're doing a simulation of cash flow discounting, would you say that you try and get 20% upfront?
I think I've seen people looking at the upfront being 10% of the maximum 1 year royalties. I've seen that figure quoted. I've not used that approach myself.
Okay. I also wanted to ask about between academic institutions and say national labs and so on and so forth, or say Battelle in the US, have you seen any differences in the licensing styles and models? And are the terms any different when they're licensing it? Do you think that their technology readiness levels are higher and therefore the terms are different?
I think the national laboratories are able, government laboratories are able to advance their technologies to a higher TRL level. I think it's one of the challenges for universities, and we still haven't solved it, although there is I think the latest budget for the National Science Foundation is going to provide money for translational research. But you have to remember, the governments fund universities to do research to advance the science base and to train the next generation of scientists, the grad students and postdocs who actually do the work. They don't set out to invent new technologies. All of this that we get is kind of a spin-off. It's gravy. And so proposals for grant funding to test a therapy that you've demonstrated already in a mouse and tested in a dog and a monkey, a study section will say, that's not innovative novel science. We're not going to fund that. We want to fund the next cancer treatment. So getting translational research funding is a challenge for, I think, many institutions. Getting proof of concept funding is a challenge. And government laboratories don't have to apply for grant by grant. They get budgets, and they can allocate those budgets to specific projects, and that's how they can take their technologies further down the road than typically universities can. I once looked at what are they called? There is an award. There's a magazine, R&D magazine.
Well, yeah, R&D World, I think probably. Battelle,
Yeah.
right? R&D
Yeah.
Mag. R&D Mag.
It awards annual prizes for novel technologies, or it ranks them. And it's been doing it for 50, 60 years. And you go back to the 60s and 70s, it was big companies were getting these prizes. And then as big companies started doing less innovative research, it moved. And if you look at the recent ones, government laboratories are getting a lot of these prizes. Now, I think part of that is there is some incentive compensation. They can get bonuses if they get awards from this. But universities rank very low. And that's because they can't do the further development to up the TRL. And universities only do well in these rankings in partnership with their spin-out companies, because the spin-out companies can raise the investment capital to do the proof of concept work that's necessary.
Mm-hmm. Are the royalty terms or the licensing terms or the structure of the deals any different if it's an NIH, say, for example, compared to a university?
I haven't seen those analyses done.
Mm-hmm.
The NIH has been a very successful licensing organization. It spends about $5 billion itself in its own labs. That's a lot of money. I mean, probably more than most universities, except the University of California. And they get a lot of income. I think they're almost embarrassed by the level of income they get. At their peak, they were getting about $100 million. In my study on the discovery of drugs by public sector research institutes, the NIH was easily top. They had discovered more new drugs that had got FDA approval than any university.
Mm-hmm. When you're entering into a licensing discussion, as a person who's negotiating a license, you probably want to try and read into what will be the motivations of the potential licensee and so on. So what kind of preparation do you do in advance of a licensing negotiation? In the sense, what do you try and research up or explore, or do you contact people, talk to them before it's typical licensing agreement discussion?
Well, you want to research your company. These days, it's pretty easy. Everybody has a website. You should go through every page on that website. You should go further and look up the key executives of that company, look at their profiles in LinkedIn and see what they say. Look at their board of directors, because their investors will be represented on that board of directors, and then look up those investors and what they are interested in. So research it. If the company is publicly traded, certainly read their 10K and a couple of their most recent 10Qs. Just learn what you can about the company. Learn what their competitors are doing.
Yeah. Ashley, can I take a couple more minutes? Just a couple more questions. Okay. The first one question is about option agreements. How can you talk a little bit about option or evaluation licenses, and how do you set an option fee?
So that's a great question. There must always be a fee because for the duration of the option, you're going to take the technology off the market. So I used to put a figure of like $10,000 or $20,000 for the option, and I would distribute that money to the inventor so that he was seeing something, because he was probably going to have to work with the company during the period of the option. If it was a substantial duration of the option, I would ask them to pay any patent costs that I incurred during the lifetime of the option. And that could be substantial. If you are getting to national phase entry during the period of the option, then that company is probably going to want you to enter the national phase in specific markets. And so they should pay for that.
Are there any licensing agreements where you have structured in a future assignment term? And if so, how does that work?
Yeah, you sometimes see an assignment fee. Now, got to remember that if it's a small company and you have shares in that company, then if they get bought, then your shares are going to suddenly become valuable. So you actually probably want them to be bought so that you get the value out of your stock. You also find so the National Institutes of Health we talked about, by law, are not allowed to take stock in spin-out companies. So what they do is they get a assignment fee, and they actually publish it. If their fee depends on the stage of development of the technology when the license was done. If they only had lab data, it's 0.5%. If they had animal data, it's 0.75%. And if they had human data, it's 3% of the value of the transaction. So if a company gets sold for $100 million and NIH had licensed them technology with animal data, with human data, then NIH would get 3% of $100 million or $3 million.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. My last question is relating to the process of how you would go about with creating leads and getting to the point of closing deals. Do you follow something like a sales process? What does the technology marketing process looks like, and how do you does it look like a typical sales funnel, or does it look very different in technology marketing?
Well, that could be the subject of a whole new talk.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's both passive marketing and active marketing. Passive marketing is when you list your technology in databases, your own website. Everybody should be listing their technologies in the autumn technology portal, whatever it's called these days. You can do that very, very cheaply. And there's thousands of technologies there, and companies do search that database. It was my last major initiative as president of Autumn was the creation of that database, and I am massively proud of it, and you should certainly be there. There aren't many other databases that people list technologies. That has not been a very successful business model. In the height of the dot-com boom, there are all sorts of websites that were going to be matchmakers. They haven't panned out.
Mm-hmm.
Active marketing means you research the market. And with the internet and good search engines, that's very easy. You research the companies that are in the space, and perhaps the big companies that have done deals with them, and you find people at those companies using the LES membership directory, using LinkedIn. LinkedIn is such a great tool for technology marketing. And you prepare a non-confidential disclosure, a one-page description with some pictures and things like that, just the bare details, and send it to these people, and do it in a way and with a subject letter title that will at least get them to open the email, open the attachment, and give you at least 30 seconds of their time, and try and stimulate them to want to know more.
Sure. Thank you very much. I'm done, Pragna. Over to you. Thank you, Ashley, for this wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. And,
the timing worked out well. We should think about another couple of sessions. I think going into much more detail on discounted cash flow.
Mm-hmm.
And I think looking at equity structures and how they change in startup companies would be good topics for you to think about for future sessions.
Sure. Thank you, Ashley. We will do that. Yeah. So
Okay.
over to you, Pragna.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Dr. Stevens, for two wonderful sessions yesterday and today. It was a great learning experience for all of us. So thanks for that. I think there
My
are no
pleasure.
more questions in the chat box now. All have been answered.
Okay, and again, as with yesterday, I will send you a copy of the talk to distribute to the attendees.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll close
Okay.
here now. Yeah, thank you very much. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.